All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about one of the most just explosive and influential cultural movements of the 20th century, Tropicalia. And believe me, this was so much more than just music. It was a full-on revolution that completely shook Brazil to its core back in the late 1960s. It all kind of boils down to this one powerful question. What happens when art, maybe even just a single song, becomes so potent, so dangerous, that a government literally declares it an enemy of the state? Well, that is the incredible story we are unpacking today. So let's set the scene. Picture it. We're in Brazil. It's the late 1960s. The country is living under a military dictatorship, and you can just feel the political tension in the air. But right under the surface of all that, a cultural volcano is just about to blow. And right at the heart of this eruption were these brilliant young artists, guys like Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil. You can think of them as the architects of this totally new artistic language, one that was about to challenge pretty much everything the establishment stood for. So what was Tropicalia exactly? Well, at its core, it was this artistic movement that created a radical mashup. I mean, imagine taking traditional Brazilian sounds, the pulse of samba and the coolness of bossa nova, and just smashing them together with electric guitars from British pop rock and those mind-bending sounds of American psychedelica. But this wasn't just some random experiment. Not at all. There was a really powerful philosophy driving it. And that brings us to this wild idea of cultural cannibalism. The actual term for it is anthropophagia. And yeah, it sounds intense because it was. This concept was actually first dreamed up by a poet named Oswald de Andrade, way back in 1928. The Tropicalistas just revived it. The whole idea was to metaphorically devour foreign influences, not to copy them, but to absorb their power and then create something totally new, potent, and unmistakably Brazilian. And when I say they devoured everything, I mean everything. They were pulling inspiration from the Beatles and from traditional samba, from psychedelic art and African rhythms. It was like they threw global and local culture into a giant blender and hit puree. So you see, it was never about rejecting the outside world. It was the complete opposite. It was like a cultural remix on the grandest scale imaginable. It was a bold statement that basically said, hey, we can take your pop culture, your art, your ideas, and we can make them powerfully our own. Now, an idea this radical was bound to cause a stir, and boy, did it ever. Everything came to a head in one single explosive year. So let's talk about 1968, the year of chaos. I mean, just look at how fast things escalated in 1968. In June, they dropped their Manifesto album. A few months later, in September, they caused a huge uproar at a major music festival. And then by December, the movement's leaders, Veloso and Gil, are arrested. It was just an incredibly dramatic rise and fall, all in the span of a few months. The performance that really lit the fuse was Caetano Veloso's song for that festival. The title alone was like a Molotov cocktail tossed right at the establishment. He borrowed it from a Parisian protest poster, and it was called É Proibido Proibir, which translates to, it is forbidden to forbid. I mean, what a direct challenge to authority, right? And it wasn't just the music that was provocative. Their whole look, their whole aesthetic was a shock to the system. You had singers like Al Costa and the band Os Mutantes, who seriously looked like they had just beamed down from another planet. Their flamboyant, totally outlandish style was just as much a part of the rebellion as any lyric they sang. So, the audience, which was mostly made up of left-wing nationalist students who wanted pure, traditional Brazilian music, they absolutely hated it. The performance caused what was described as a near riot. The artists were booed, jeered, people were pelting them with fruit, vegetables, eggs, you name it. It was an all-out cultural war happening live on stage. This kind of confrontation, you just know it couldn't last. The consequences for this artistic rebellion were severe, and they were very real. Which brings us to the movement's darkest chapter, being censored and exiled. The thing is, the Tropicalistas were politically homeless. They were getting attacked from both sides. The right-wing military government saw them as unpatriotic and a threat to order. But at the same time, the cultural left saw them as inauthentic sellouts who were corrupted by American and British pop music. They were just completely caught in a cultural crossfire. The government's reaction was swift, and it was brutal. For their arts, for their music, Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil were arrested. And eventually, they were forced into exile from their own country, for 2 long years. And that right there, that's the human cost of this whole confrontation. The movement's leaders were silenced, they were removed. By the early 1970s, the movement itself was basically over, stamped out by the regime. But the ideas they unleashed, those were impossible to contain. And that brings us to our final section, because even though Tropicalia itself was so short-lived, its impact created this everlasting echo, one you can still hear today all around the world. So, if you're curious and want to really explore the sound of Tropicalia, these albums are the absolute best place to start. They were all released during that one chaotic year, 1968, and they're basically the movement's foundational documents. And the crazy thing is, they still sound incredibly fresh and revolutionary even now. Tropicalia's legacy is just immense. It went on to inspire generations of artists way outside of Brazil. We're talking everyone from David Byrne to Beck, even Kurt Cobain. It completely redefined what was possible for Brazilian music and became this powerful global symbol for artistic freedom in the face of censorship. And that's a fight that, continues to this day. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. The Tropicalistas, they were attacked for being inauthentic. But in our world today, with global pop, TikTok trends, digital remixes, what does cultural authenticity even mean anymore? It's a question Tropicalia forced Brazil to ask more than 50 years ago, and honestly, it feels more relevant now than ever before.